One of your areas of expertise is working with the children themselves, and not just the parents, but working with the children. And you really know children. And I think for some percentage of the Courageous Parents Network population, their children have cognitive impairment or are so young that they're not going to be having conversations with their children. But there's a large population for whom that is not true, that their children do know what's going on or may know what's going on, and these are parents wondering how to talk with their children, what to say, what can their children handle. Your book has so much practical advice for how language to use, opportunities for having conversations like in the car, on a hike, finding when your children like to connect. So the book has a lot of detail, but in this conversation right now, what would you have parents understand just generally about going there with your child around the difficult things, around what children can handle, about knowing that they have a serious condition? And as things shift and maybe they're not getting better and end of life is something that is more likely, then how to transition the conversation to that. Giving parents the confidence to have the conversation, permission to have the conversation, bandwidth to not have the conversation, like what, I don't know. How would you say?
I would say that a parent needs to probably have not exactly have come to terms, but at least to have acknowledged in his or her own heart that her child is not likely to live. To have, and therefore, for at least some parents, it may not be too far from the time that their child does die, because they haven't acknowledged it to themselves up until that point. With other parents, and it depends so much on the child, and it depends what the child is asking, and also what is behind what the child is asking. A child saying at the beginning of treatment of where they have a perfectly good prognosis, am I going to die? Because they hear that, then they have at some level know that people with cancer, particularly adults, do sometimes die, is a very different question. And but asking, well, what's leading you to ask that, or what's behind that question? Probably you will get more information. You know what question you're really dealing with, which may be, well, I've heard that people with cancer do die, so am I going to? And at that point, you're honestly likely to be able to say, well, most children who have the kind of cancer you have get treatment and actually do very well. And we certainly hope that that's going to be the case with you. We'll, if ever you're worrying, ask us some more, and we'll tell you. And that's at a very different, that's a very different situation from when a child down the road, when they have relapsed and they're getting experimental treatment, but still that could work. It's a different question and may require a somewhat different answer. Again, with, we're trying some new medicine, and we're very much hoping that it works. We will keep you, we'll keep you posted. Always ask us if you have concerns. And then, so sort of, you're being honest, but you're not emphasizing the fact that they could die. And if the child asks more, and depending on the age, an adolescent probably has a very good idea of what the reality could be. And then that may require a rather different conversation. But it's sort of giving openings, trying to understand where the child is, what they're ready to hear. And it's, that's where a hypothetical is. If you were to get, do you want to know? I remember a conversation that and it's sort of, it's trying to find out, being able to have conversations at any time when the opening comes up. It's not a single conversation. It's sort of being aware and attuned to the questions that a child is bringing up at any point in their treatment. And I was thinking of a situation where a child had actually had relapsed herself, was going to need a transplant. And we felt her parents had not told her that a child she'd known very well had died. And we thought that when she was going into the hospital again, she was going to find out, so she needed to be told. So she was told that, and she was very upset, and she decided what she was going to do. She came to my office and we wrote a letter to the parents of the child. And then she wanted to know if she was going to die, and she was going to have it. It was a transplant that had a reasonable chance of success, but it had a reasonable chance of failure too. So it was so I took the opportunity of saying to her, so I said, well, we hope that, it does, people are often do get better for having had this transplant. And we hope that will be the case with you. And there was a film that, at that point, Dana had films that you showed children before they went in transplant. The first question she wanted to ask about the children shown in the films were, are they alive? And luckily, both of them had survived, so we could truthfully say, yes, they were. But what I then asked her was, and she said, well, if I'm going to die, I don't want to know. Having just been asking me all this. And I said, are you sure? Because, how will you know? If we can't tell you what the truth is, how are you going to know when to believe us or not? And she paused and she thought, well, that's true. She said, I think I do want to know. And then, in fact, she actually went on ahead and did very, very well. But if she had not done well, I would have taken us back to that conversation, because I wouldn't have assumed that what she said then was necessarily what she would want at the time she really had got worse. So I would sort of be feeling out, I said, remember that conversation we had just before? What are you thinking about that right now? She would perfectly well realize what I was saying, that she probably had got worse because she was a highly intelligent child. But it would have sort of, that was asking for permission. I would have wanted to, since she was obviously a little ambivalent, I would want to know where her position was as things had got worse.
Parents sometimes don't talk to their children about what's happening because they think that they need to protect their child from the possibility that they could die, or the fact that they are dying in that moment, or that the treatments aren't working and now they're dying. Whereas the research indicates that children do typically know and are thinking it's their job to protect their parents from the hurtful conversation. So we're not going to have me doing this. Can you talk a little bit about what you believe and have learned about how the children's dynamic with their parents, not so much the parents' dynamic with their child, but the children who are old enough to be in control of how they interact with their parents around serious illness?
I mean, I do think it depends very much on the comfort level of the parent having these conversations, how prepared the child is to have them. I mean, I do remember one situation where I think that they were not, this was a child who had a very bad prognosis, and parents were separated, and the child was clearly talking about what heaven was like, and with both of her parents separately, who did not get on. And to one parent wouldn't talk about it, and would basically say, well, we don't have to think about that. We don't. So there, with one parent, the avenue of talking was shut down. But the other parent was much more prepared to think about what heaven was like, to fantasize about it. And the child said to that parent, I like your answer better than I liked the other parent, which sort of gave that parent that it was okay to have these conversations. And they weren't saying that the child was dying, but it was clearly the child was there, the child was moving in that direction, and was really saying, and I want to be able to talk about it. So I remember saying to another parent, because she was saying, I couldn't possibly talk about, it was a child with a brain tumor who was going to die. And I just said, well, I think you'll know when you feel it's the right moment. And she told me later that actually one night when he was having a bath, and they did begin to talk about it. It is sort of, I saw it more as a process, and that it's a process that the parent needs to come along to a certain point before they can begin to even think about having a conversation. And maybe, and sometimes, in my example, even adolescents have very different ways that they choose to die, and whom they choose to talk about it with and who they don't. And sometimes they choose not to talk about it with anybody. And that's sometimes who they are, and that's how they want it to be. So I think I'm a respecter of different routes, and not a deep believer that there's only one.
I love what you said about how you told this mom, you're going to know when the moment, if and when the moment is right. You will know. And that's this notion of confidence is really important to what Courageous Parents Network is trying to do, is give parents the confidence that they will be able to do this, and that they will know what to do when the moment comes. And that's a great that's a great example, because no parent can imagine that they could possibly talk to their child about their child's end of life. Like that's crazy making. Like that's an impossible thing. So the default is going to be never in a million years. That's like out of a nightmare. That's not even
right.
But in fact, if it is part of your reality, you will be able to do it. It's a little bit of just trust me. You will be able to do this. Trust yourself. Actually, trust yourself.
But that if it doesn't happen, or it may happen in other ways. I mean, it may happen in indirect ways. It may happen in, but that if they've thought about it and they are trying to prepare themselves, I would agree with you that they will feel what is right for them at that moment.